Late at night, Marcus Reed drove down a quiet street, eager to get home after a long shift. The streets were mostly empty, with only a few cars passing by. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. Almost midnight. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, but he remained alert. Years of training had made him that way. As a Secret Service agent, he had learned to stay aware of his surroundings, no matter how calm things seemed. Just as he was about to turn onto the main road, he noticed the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A police car had pulled up behind him, siren blaring. Marcus frowned, puzzled. He hadn't broken any traffic laws. His speed was within the limit, and he hadn't missed a single sign. Still, he knew what to do. Without hesitation, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. As he waited, two officers stepped out of the police car and approached him. Their footsteps were firm, their expressions unreadable. Marcus had been in tense situations before, but something about the way they walked toward him made his instincts kick in. He had seen this before, not as an agent, but as an ordinary man. The taller officer knocked on his window. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice flat but firm. Marcus nodded, moving slowly. "Sure, officer. My wallet is in my inside pocket. I'm going to reach for it now." He spoke calmly, making sure to keep his tone polite. As he handed over his ID, the second officer leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing at him. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "From work," Marcus replied simply. The taller officer flipped open his ID and squinted at it. "Secret Service, huh?" His tone carried disbelief. He turned to his partner. "You ever seen one of these before?" His partner smirked. "Nope. Looks fake." Marcus felt a flicker of frustration, but kept his expression neutral. "It's real. I work for the Secret Service." The officers exchanged looks. The taller one stepped back slightly, his hand resting near his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Marcus hesitated. He had done nothing wrong. His ID was valid, but he also knew that refusing wouldn't help. With a quiet sigh, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. The moment he did, one of the officers grabbed his arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. "Hey, what's going on?" Marcus asked, caught off guard. "You're resisting," the officer muttered. Marcus gritted his teeth. "No, I'm not." But before he could say anything else, he felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists. A few feet away, a man walking his dog stopped, pulling out his phone to record. The night had been peaceful just moments ago, but now something was unfolding, something that would soon spread far beyond this street. Marcus felt the cold steel of the handcuffs tighten around his wrists, his heart pounding with frustration. He had been through intense situations before, protecting high-profile officials, handling security threats. But this was different. He was being treated like a criminal for no reason. The officer gripping his arm gave him a slight push. "Walk to the car." Marcus inhaled deeply, controlling his emotions. He had been trained for pressure, but this wasn't just pressure. It was humiliation. The second officer held his Secret Service ID, flipping it over as if trying to find something wrong with it. "This doesn't look real," he muttered. Marcus turned his head slightly. "It's real. Call the number on the back. They'll verify my identity." The taller officer scoffed. "Oh, so now you're giving us orders." Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't giving orders. He was simply stating facts. But arguing wouldn't help. He knew that much. By now, a small crowd had gathered. A few people had their phones out, recording. The man with the dog from earlier stood near the curb, staring in disbelief. "Hey, I think he's really Secret Service," one of the bystanders said. "You guys might be making a mistake." The officers ignored them. One of them radioed in something, but Marcus couldn't hear what. "Turn around," the officer commanded. Marcus did as he was told, his wrists still locked in the cuffs. "We're taking you in for further questioning." Marcus let out a slow breath. On what charge? Suspicious activity. Suspicious activity. He had been driving home. That wasn't a crime. Just then, a woman stepped forward from the crowd. "I got the whole thing on video," she called out. "This doesn't look right." The officers stiffened, exchanging glances. Marcus didn't move, didn't resist. He knew how these things played out. Any wrong move, any raised voice, and the situation could spiral. The taller officer tightened his grip on Marcus's arm, leading him toward the squad car. Just as they were about to put him inside, a voice crackled through the radio. A pause. The officers exchanged glances again. Something had changed. The second officer sighed, then looked at Marcus. "Sit tight." They stepped away, whispering to each other near the car. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He didn't know what had just happened, but he could tell one thing. Something was shifting. The air was thick with tension as Marcus stood near the police car, his wrists still locked in the cold metal cuffs. The officers whispered to each other a few feet away, their expressions shifting from confidence to uncertainty. Something had changed. The crowd had grown larger. People were murmuring among themselves, their phones still recording. A few voices spoke up. "This doesn't feel right. They haven't even told him what he did wrong." Marcus remained calm, but inside frustration was building. He had followed every rule. He had been respectful, cooperative, and clear. Yet here he was, treated like a suspect for no reason. He had spent years protecting important people, working in high-security situations, and now, on a quiet street, just minutes from home, he found himself in a situation that shouldn't be happening. The second officer glanced at the crowd, shifting uncomfortably. It was clear that the presence of cameras was making them nervous. The taller officer spoke into his radio again, this time with a lower voice, as if trying to keep the conversation private. A moment later, one of the bystanders stepped forward. He was a middle-aged man in a suit, his expression serious. His name was David Collins, a lawyer who had been watching the entire time. "Officers," he said firmly, "I suggest you verify his ID immediately. If this man is who he says he is, you're making a mistake that could cost you your badges." The taller officer turned sharply. "Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you." David folded his arms. "Actually, it does. And if you continue to detain him without cause, this video will concern the entire country by morning." The officer hesitated. He looked at the woman holding her phone up, at the man with the dog, at the growing number of people who had stopped to watch. Marcus met his eyes. "Check my credentials," he said again, his voice steady. "Call the number on the back of my ID." The second officer finally pulled out his radio and spoke into it. Marcus listened carefully as a dispatcher on the other end responded. There was a pause. Then suddenly, the second officer's posture changed. His eyes widened slightly, and he quickly turned to his partner. "We need to let him go." His voice was lower now, as if he didn't want the crowd to hear. The taller officer frowned. "What?" The second officer swallowed. "He's real." A heavy silence filled the air. The onlookers seemed to sense that something was shifting. The taller officer hesitated, his pride clearly fighting against the truth. But there was no way around it now. The second officer stepped forward and, with a stiff motion, unlocked the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. "You're free to go," he muttered. But it was too late. The damage had been done. And Marcus knew this wasn't over yet. Marcus rubbed his wrists as the cold metal cuffs were removed. Even though he was free now, the weight of what had just happened still sat heavily on his shoulders. The officers who had been so firm moments ago now looked uneasy. The second officer avoided his gaze, while the taller one's jaw was clenched, his face unreadable. The crowd had fallen silent for a moment, watching to see what would happen next. Then someone spoke. "So that's it. You just let him go like nothing happened." Another person chimed in. "You had no reason to arrest him in the first place." The lawyer, David Collins, stepped closer. His arms were still folded, his expression sharp. You detained a federal agent, accused him without cause, and now you're just going to walk away." The taller officer shot him a look but didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to Marcus. "You're free to go," he repeated, as if that would fix everything. Marcus took a slow breath. He knew making this scene wouldn't help, but he also couldn't ignore what had just happened. He glanced at the woman still recording, at the other onlookers who had spoken up. These weren't just people watching. They were witnesses. One of them, the young man in a hoodie, stepped forward. "This is already going viral, man. Everyone's gonna see this." Marcus wasn't surprised. People had their phones out the entire time. The video would spread. The world would see exactly what happened on this street tonight. The second officer, looking uncomfortable, finally spoke. "Look, maybe we were a little quick to judge." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Quick to judge?" The officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We thought." "You thought I didn't belong here," Marcus finished for him. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Neither officer responded. The taller one's grip tightened on his belt as he finally muttered, "We were just doing our job." David Collins let out a short laugh. Your job is to serve and protect, not arrest someone without reason." The crowd murmured in agreement. A few people shook their heads. Marcus looked at both officers. "You could have just checked my ID from the start. Instead, you put me in cuffs first." The taller officer's jaw tightened, but he had no response. By now, a third police car had pulled up. A high-ranking officer, likely a sergeant, stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene. The moment he saw Marcus, his expression changed. "Agent Reed?" he asked, his tone different from the others. "Respectful." Marcus nodded. The sergeant turned to the officers. "You two, my office. Now." The officers stiffened. They knew what that meant. The crowd watched as the sergeant led the officers away. This wasn't over. Not for them, and not for Marcus. The tension in the air hadn't disappeared, even though the officers who arrested Marcus had been taken aside by their superior. The crowd was still there, their eyes shifting between Marcus and the police station where the two officers had just been led. People whispered to each other, some shaking their heads in frustration, others looking at their phones as they checked the videos spreading online. Marcus, however, remained calm. Years of working in high-pressure situations had trained him to stay composed, even when everything inside him screamed for justice. He glanced down at his wrists. They were slightly red from the handcuffs, but the real damage wasn't physical. David Collins, the lawyer who had stepped in earlier, walked over to him. "You all right?" Marcus gave a small nod. "I've been through worse. But this is the kind of thing that shouldn't happen at all." David sighed. "It's already out there. People are watching this video right now, and trust me, this won't just disappear." Marcus knew he was right. In his line of work, he had seen how quickly news could spread, how a single incident could shift public perception. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been in similar situations but didn't have the resources or the position to defend themselves. A woman from the crowd stepped forward hesitantly. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry this happened to you," she said softly. "It wasn't right." Marcus met her gaze and gave a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you." Just then, the sergeant who had taken the officers inside returned. His face was serious as he approached Marcus. "Agent Reed, I just got off the phone with your department. They confirmed everything." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Took long enough." The sergeant sighed, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight. It was mishandled." Marcus studied the man's expression. He could tell the sergeant was being careful with his words, trying not to admit too much, but also not deny what had happened. "The officers involved will be investigated," the sergeant continued. "They're on leave until we sort this out." Marcus let the words settle for a moment before he spoke. "You and I both know This isn't just about them. This is about how things like this keep happening. The sergeant exhaled, nodding slowly. I understand. But did he? Marcus wasn't sure. The crowd started dispersing, but the energy in the air remained. The woman with the phone was still recording, and Marcus knew that by morning, this moment would be seen by thousands, maybe millions. This wasn't over. Not yet. The next few hours felt like a blur for Marcus. After the surgeon's apology, the scene started to clear up. The crowd slowly dispersed, though many lingered, exchanging words and scrolling through their phones. The video was already making its rounds on social media, and Marcus knew it wouldn't be long before the entire country would be talking about what had happened. Marcus stood there for a moment, feeling the cool night air brush against his skin. His car, now free of flashing police lights, still sat a few feet away, but it might as well have been a million miles away in his mind. He had come so close to letting the frustration take over, to raising his voice and pushing back harder against the officers. But he hadn't. In the end, he had played it calm, letting the officers' mistakes speak for themselves. But now that he was free, that quiet rage began to simmer under the surface. David Collins, the lawyer who had stayed behind, approached him once again. "I've seen it all," David said quietly, his eyes scanning the area. "This kind of thing happens far too often, but not many people get to witness it firsthand." Marcus shook his head. "It's not enough. Not by a long shot. People think this is just a one-off incident, but it's not. This happens to so many others who don't have the chance to stand up for themselves. Some of them don't even get to speak." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, and that's exactly why your story needs to be heard." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his supervisor at the Secret Service. It simply read, "We've seen the video. We'll handle it. Expect a call from the department soon." Marcus let out a slow breath. He knew what that meant. The wheels of bureaucracy were already turning. They'd make sure he was taken care of. But it wasn't about him anymore. He realized that he would need to be the voice for everyone who had ever been wronged by an unchecked system. David glanced over at Marcus. "The department's handling it, but they won't be able to stop the conversation that's already started. You know that, right?" Marcus looked at him, his gaze hardening. "I'm not doing this for me. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone else who's been treated the same way, everyone else who couldn't speak up. This goes beyond one bad encounter." David's eyes softened with understanding. "Exactly. The whole world is watching now. People are going to have to pay attention." Just then, the sound of another police car pulled up. Marcus turned his head to see another officer approach, this one a woman. She was older, with a calm demeanor, and she didn't look like she was here to add to the drama. She walked up to Marcus. "Agent Reed," she said, her voice respectful. He nodded. "Yes, I'm Detective Lisa Taylor." She introduced herself. "I've been assigned to look into the situation tonight. We take this seriously." Marcus studied her face, then glanced back at David. There was something different in the way she spoke. She wasn't here to cover anything up or pass the blame. "Thank you," Marcus replied, trying to read her expression. "I'm glad someone's looking into it." Detective Taylor nodded. "We'll be in touch with you soon. I know this hasn't been easy. I want you to know, we're investigating this thoroughly. Everyone involved will be held accountable." The words felt like a small step in the right direction. But Marcus wasn't sure if that would be enough. He wasn't sure if the system would change, no matter how many apologies and investigations followed. But for the first time tonight, he felt a little hope. He'd been heard, and now his story could become part of something bigger. "I'll be waiting," Marcus said, his voice steady. Detective Taylor nodded, then turned and walked back to her car. Marcus and David exchanged one last look before they both knew it was time to leave. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Marcus had just taken the first step toward something that could make a difference. And as he got into his car, his phone buzzing again with messages and notifications, He knew that this wasn't just his fight anymore. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage, investigations, and public outcry. The video of Marcus's encounter with the police had gone viral, and what started as a simple traffic stop was now a topic of national conversation. News outlets ran stories, social media exploded with opinions, and people everywhere seemed to be talking about what had happened on that quiet street. Marcus, for the first time, felt like he was caught in the middle of something much bigger than himself. The Secret Service had issued a statement, backing Marcus's account of the incident and promising a thorough review of the situation. His phone rang constantly, filled with calls from his colleagues, reporters, and even people he hadn't spoken to in years. He was a federal agent. He was used to the pressure and the scrutiny, but this felt different. This was about more than just his role as a protector of public figures. This was about racial profiling, about the way some people were treated simply because of their appearance, about the biases that often went unchecked. Marcus had always believed in the system. He had devoted his life to protecting it. But now he found himself questioning whether the system truly protected everyone equally. And that thought made him uneasy. One afternoon, as Marcus sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the pile of paperwork that had started to accumulate in front of him, his phone buzzed. It was a message from David Collins, the lawyer who had stood up for him on that night. "We need to talk. There's something you should know." Marcus stared at the message for a moment before tapping out a quick reply. "What's going on?" David's response came almost immediately. "It's about the officers involved. The investigation is moving faster than expected, and there are things you should hear directly from me." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The investigation had been moving forward, but he hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. He picked up the phone and called David back. When David answered, his voice was calm but serious. "Marcus, I've seen the internal report. The officers who detained you are in serious trouble." Marcus's breath caught. "What do you mean?" David hesitated. "It turns out there's a history with them. This isn't the first time they've acted inappropriately with civilians. The department knew, but they didn't take action. Not until now. And now they're being held accountable." Marcus let that sink in for a moment. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "So what happens now?" David's voice softened. "The department has already placed both officers on administrative leave. They're being investigated for misconduct, and this time, it's going to be different. There's more pressure on the department to get this right." A weight lifted slightly off Marcus's shoulders, but he knew that the fight was far from over. Even though the officers involved were facing consequences, it wasn't just about those two. It was about the larger system. The bigger issues that had allowed these kinds of situations to happen again and again without real change. "I'm glad they're being held accountable," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But this goes beyond them. We need to make sure something like this never happens again." David agreed. "That's the goal. The department is going to face more scrutiny than they ever have before, and there's a real chance to make meaningful change. But it starts with people like you who are willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" Marcus exhaled slowly. "I'll do whatever it takes. We need to make sure no one else goes through what I did. I don't want anyone else to feel powerless when they're just trying to get home." David was quiet for a moment before responding. "You're already making a difference. Trust me, this won't be forgotten. You've made sure of that." Marcus ended the call and sat back in his chair, looking out the window. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like real change was possible. He had been a part of something that could shape the future, and maybe, just maybe, this was the moment things began to shift. The fight wasn't over, but now he knew he wasn't fighting alone. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself at the center of a whirlwind he hadn't expected. The news coverage had only intensified. Stories were being written about his experience. Interviews were being requested, and even the president had made a statement, acknowledging the need for change. But for Marcus, The attention didn't matter as much as the larger conversation that was unfolding around him. The investigation into the two officers who had arrested him was moving quickly. Internal Affairs had uncovered that they had been involved in previous incidents of questionable behavior, including racial profiling. The officers had been placed on unpaid leave, and there was talk of their termination. But Marcus knew that the consequences for them weren't enough. This was just the beginning. He couldn't let their actions define how things would go forward. Marcus had started receiving messages and letters from people who had experienced similar situations, some who had been wronged, some who had been silenced, and others who simply wanted to say they understood. Their words made his heart heavy, but also gave him strength. He had always believed that there was power in speaking up, but now he truly understood the weight of those words. David, the lawyer who had stood by him from the very beginning, had kept him in the loop about the ongoing investigation. It wasn't just about the officers anymore. It was about systemic change. David's firm had already begun to work with several civil rights groups, pushing for reforms in how police departments trained their officers, how they interacted with the communities they served, and how they held their own accountable. One afternoon, Marcus was sitting in his office at the Secret Service when he received a call from Detective Lisa Taylor, the officer who had promised to take the investigation seriously. "Agent Reed, I wanted to personally update you on what's happened so far. The department is starting to implement new measures. There's going to be a complete overhaul of our training programs, with a focus on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias." Marcus listened intently, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "What about the officers involved in my case?" "They're facing disciplinary action," she said. "But we're also looking at ways to ensure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. We're reviewing all complaints and allegations from the past, looking for patterns." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "Thank you, Detective," he said. "I appreciate the work you're doing. I just want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. We're committed to transparency, Agent Reed, and I want you to know you've helped push for that change. It wouldn't have happened without you." After hanging up, Marcus sat back in his chair, reflecting on how far things had come. The path ahead was still long, but the momentum was there. The public's attention was focused on the issue now. People were demanding change, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. But the most powerful feeling came from knowing that through his actions, others who had been mistreated would now have a voice. They wouldn't be ignored anymore. They wouldn't have to suffer in silence. Marcus had become more than just an agent in that moment. He had become a symbol of strength, of resistance, and of hope. As he looked out of the window at the busy street below, he thought about all the people who were still out there, still facing the kind of injustice he had experienced. He thought about the change that was possible, the progress that was being made. And with that thought, Marcus knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. The fight for equality, for fairness, for justice, it was a fight that would go on. But now, he knew that with every step forward, they were getting closer to making things right.